welcome to the next module. In this module, we will be looking at biogeochemical cycles and Arctic. Let us start with the climate change. The climate change alters the biogeochemical cycle. So, Arctic warming also affects the biogeochemical cycle. The Arctic warming results in the change of diatoms, chironomid and cladoceran communities and their functionalities. The Arctic warming also affects terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Due to Arctic warming, there is response by plants, microbes and biogeochemical processes. When we talk about the biogeochemical cycle of Arctic Ocean, there are lots of nutrients transported to and from Arctic Ocean. This leads to changes in primary production, also changes in enhanced stratification, Arctic sea ice exchange of CO2. We will be studying about ocean acidification soon. And there is an internal cycling to materials with respect to shells and in deep basins. And it affects macronutrients, iron, organic substance and sediments. There is a flow at the interfaces between sea ice and ocean and between the atmosphere, snow and ice. So the macronutrients also there is a due to shift ice drift induced by winds and ocean currents. This leads to spreads laterally into other sea ice regions. And the biogeochemical cycle also affects the tundra carbon cycling. The Arctic rivers and the streams are affected by the seasonal variation, and in the Arctic rivers and stream the nutrients are moving. So these were the overall picture of biogeochemical cycle in the Arctic region. So here is the change in the amount of greenhouse gases, mainly methane and carbon dioxide. The change is given in parts per billion. That is, methane had increased by 150% from 1750 to 2011. N2O had increased by 20% from 1750 to 2011. So here are the changes in the ppb levels. So from 722 it had increased to 1803 parts per billion. And when we look at the change in carbon dioxide concentration, there is an increase of 40% from 1750 to 2011. So now currently we have close to 400 ppm of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what are the contributors to anthropogenic gas emissions? For CO2, fossil fuel combustion, cement production, wood burning, land use, etc. are responsible. For methane, natural wetland emissions, agricultural and waste, especially rice, animal and waste. Similarly, fossil fuel related emissions, geological, termites and freshwater emissions leads to production of methane. And biomass and biofuel burning also produces methane. And in the case of N2O, nitrification and denitrification reactions of reactive nitrogens in the oil and in the ocean, application of nitrogenous fertilizers in agriculture, fossil fuel use and industrial process biomass burning including the biofuel burning. Similarly, land emission due to atmospheric nitrogen deposition. So these are all the contributors of anthropogenic gas emissions. And when we look at carbon, the vegetation and living biomass contains carbon. They are present as dead organic matters in the case of litters and soils. That's also present in wet soils. Permafrost soil have some amount of overlap with wetland soils. So these are all the sources of carbon. And how the carbon is removed? Carbon is removed as a carbon dioxide. So plant photosynthesis, that is especially the gross primary production, is happening only during the growing season, which removes carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. How carbon dioxide is released? Autotrophic plant, they respire, leads to the release of carbon dioxide. This is happening all throughout the year. When heterotrophic species also, that is soil, microbial, animal respiration also is happening throughout the year. Wildfire also releases carbon dioxide. So there is a change in carbon cycle. And what are all the seasonal cycles that are occurring? The greater landmass in northern hemisphere actually happens because winter and summer have a different carbon cycles. Similarly, the characteristic sawtooth pattern, that is Keeling curve, is also responsible. We call that as a breathing of earth. So what are the sources of methane? We have various sources. We will first look at the thermogenic sources, which may be due to natural emission from geological sources like marine seepage, terrestrial seepage, geothermal vent and mud volcanoes all produce methane. Emissions from the fossil fuel and extraction and use include natural gas, coal and oil industry. And we also have the pyrogenic release of methane, that is due to incomplete burning of fossil fuels or incomplete burning of plant biomass. It may be due to natural fires or anthropogenic fires. And we also have biogenic sources of methane. One is the natural one, which is produced from wetland, termites or small emission from the ocean. We also have anthropogenic emissions, which include rice paddy agriculture, ruminant livestock, landfills, man-made lakes and wetlands, wastewater treatment. All of these things produce methane. Methane biogenically also produced from organic matter under low oxygen conditions, that is fermentation process by methanogenic microbes. We will study about methanogenesis in the later part. So how methane is being removed? For the primary process is by photochemical methods, that is reactions with OH radical removes methane, and there are also secondary process which happens in the stratosphere, that is reaction with the chlorine and oxygen radicals, or in the well aerated solids by oxidation, or in the marine boundary layer by possible reactions with chlorine. These are all the various ways by which methane can be removed. So let us look at the pre-industrial era of nitrogen cycle. Because carbon cycle, nitrogen cycles are important biogeochemical cycle. Now we are looking at the nitrogen cycle. So reactive nitrogen refers to nitrogen compounds that are biologically or chemically reactive, which includes ammonia, nitrites, nitrates and nitrous oxide. These compounds are basically produced through natural process as well as human activities. So we have non-reactive atmospheric nitrogen, because our atmosphere contains maximum more than 70% of nitrogen. So this is basically a non-reactive nitrogen. When lightning happens, this non-reactive nitrogen is converted into reactive nitrogen. This becomes the input for land and ocean biosphere. Once the input comes, these are later on removed by denitrification reaction and nitrogen is released as non-reactive to the atmosphere. Similarly, the non-reactive atmospheric nitrogen also is converted by biological means, which is called the nitrogen fixation, where nitrogen is converted to ammonia by microbial process. So these are all the various nitrogen cycles which were happening before the pre-industrial era. What are the anthropogenic sources of reactive nitrogen? The first one is the most famous Haber-Bosch industrial process, which is used to make ammonia from nitrogen for the nitrogen fertilizers and as feedstock for some industries. So this is the biggest industry in the entire world. The second one is the cultivation of legumes and other crops, which increases biological nitrogen fixation, which is called BNF. And the combustion of fossil fuels, which converts atmospheric nitrogen and fossil fuel nitrogen into nitrogen oxides, which are emitted into atmosphere and redeposited at the surface. And the negative one is emissions of reactive nitrogen to the atmosphere as ammonia and nitrogen oxides are caused by agricultural and fossil fuel combustion. These are all the anthropogenic sources of reactive nitrogen. So what are the negative impacts of the anthropogenic reactive nitrogen, or basically the reactive nitrogens? The reactive nitrogen has a number of negative impacts if not converted back to the normal nitrogen, that is atmospheric nitrogen, which is harmless, non-reactive nitrogen. The reactive nitrogen contributes to climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion. We will look at the various reactions where ozone is depleted in the later part. Formation of smog, which is related to Arctic haze. We will also study about this. Increase in haziness of the troposphere. Acidification of soil and fresh waters. Eutrophication and reduction in biodiversity in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Increase in nitrogen oxides, aerosols, tropospheric ozone and nitrates in drinking water have negative impact on human health. These are all the negative impact of reactive nitrogen species. Let us look at what is nitrogen cascade. It is a process in which reactive nitrogen, that is ammonia or nitrogen oxides, contributes to all of the impacts which are shown in the previous slide. The nitrogen cascade is a sequential transfer of same reactive nitrogen atom through the atmosphere, terrestrial ecosystem, freshwater ecosystems and marine ecosystem that results in multiple effect in each reservoir. Because of the nitrogen cascade, the creation of any molecule of reactive nitrogen from atmospheric nitrogen at any location has the potential to affect climate either directly or indirectly. This potential exists until the reactive nitrogen converted back to normal nitrogen, that is non-reactive nitrogen in the atmosphere. So what are the negative impacts of reactive nitrogen in the Arctic, because we are going to look at specific to Arctic region. So what are the impact areas? The first one is ecosystem disruption. So how does it affect? It affects the species composition, loss of biodiversity, and changes in vegetation structures in Arctic tundra. How it affects the permafrost degradation? It accelerates the thawing of permafrost, releasing greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane, and contributing to climate change. So what are the negative impact on the marine ecosystems? So eutrophication, shifts in phytoplankton communities, potential ocean acidification, and impacts on marine food webs are the negative effects. And with respect to freshwater and wetland, eutrophication of Arctic lakes and wetlands, oxygen depletion, and changes in hydrological cycle are some of the impacts. And with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, increased N2O emissions from nitrogen deposition increases the climate change. With respect to air quality and pollution, the nitrogen oxide and ammonia pollution form long-range atmospheric transport which affects the air quality. Similarly, cultural and economic impact, threats to indigenous livelihoods, that is reindeer herding, are changing due to changes in the pasture quality and ecosystem degradation. These are all the negative effects in the Arctic region.